Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake, and a large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. And as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up, and he followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners."
Thanks a lot, Paige. You can have a seat. Last week, Chuck highlighted what makes Mark's gospel urgent. And just to review, and we'll do that in this first portion of what we're in the teaching this morning, it's the shortest gospel. It moves very quickly. There's a lot more doing than teaching. There's a lot more action than the other gospels. It uses the word immediately a lot. And so in Mark's gospel, you have this profound sense of urgency that perhaps isn't communicated to such a degree in the other three gospels. And it begs the question, with what urgency do we live out our faith in Christ? Or do we anticipate the routine of life to be transmitted into our faith routine? I know a lot of you have a routine of coming together every Sunday morning here, and we are grateful for that, part of the routine. I don't know what urgency would look like on a Sunday morning. I don't even want to play that game, but the reality is there an urgency to how I live out my faith? People proclaim these are the end times. If we knew Thursday at 2:45 p.m. Jesus was returning, I'd live my life of faith with a little different urgency, wouldn't I? But that's what Mark's gospel, the urgent gospel, is communicating, that there's a time is at stake, lives are at stake. And why this is so important to me, friends, this morning, is I've watched the evolution of culture, and I've watched the evolution of church culture. And see, with every year, apparently there are more and more people struggling. More and more of us struggling for a variety of reasons. And certainly the world is having its issues, but so are we. And so I think there's an urgency to how we pursue what we're pursuing together. It reminds me of one of my favorite stories, and I share it with you every 5 years, like clockwork. But I think it sums it up. It's a golfing story, and this is a hack golfer who's out, and he drives the tee, and his ball runs about 95 yards down the fairway and lands right on an anthill, smack on top of a huge anthill. He steps up, he dresses the ball, swings, huge swing, and he totally misses the ball and slaughters hundreds of ants. It's a slaughter. He steps back and ants are scurrying, you understand, all over. He swings again, second swing, misses the ball again, only this time he kills thousands of ants. Oh, the carnage and the chaos. It was the greatest ant massacre in the history of ant history. And at that moment, one of the ants was heard to shout, "We'd better get on the ball, or we're all going to die." The reason I love that joke is it always gets that response, but there's a deep truth beneath that. That's why I keep bringing it back every 5 years. You understand the point. We're starting a series we could have entitled Fun with Stickers, and I'll explain that in just a minute too. But there's something serious at stake here, folks, and a lot of what's at stake has to do with who we are, the people we love, the situations we find ourselves in. There's an urgency to how we are called to live out our faith today because of the state of the union, both individually and collectively. And we want to do something about it. That's what makes this series so unique of any series I've ever been a part of. I would argue in the history of TFRC, we've never done a series where what happens after this service matters a whole lot more than what we did in the service for 16 weeks worth. I want to share with you the Good News Challenge before we continue. Chuck outlined it last week, and we'll highlight it again today. we're going to ask you to participate in a grand experiment over the next 16 weeks, this Good News Challenge. It's a weekly commitment to put our faith into action in a very specific but tangible way. I think, and you look around this room and imagine the first service as well, in the ministry we call TFRC, there's approximately 1,500 to 2,000 people that call this their church home. And I'm not saying bigger is better. I'm just saying bigger has greater potential impact. Imagine if 1,500 men, women, children, and teens truly started living out their faith with an urgency. Do you think we could make a difference? Do you think we could make a difference? I believe we can radically impact the entire Magic Valley. I know what 12 young kids did 2,000 years ago. And that's what this is about, taking our faith beyond the closing song. The Good News Challenge. The design of the the Good News Challenge, is we're all committing to the same discipleship action. Now, I know you love Jesus, you follow Jesus, we do a variety of things for Jesus. But from week to week, what we're going to challenge you to do is all be a part of doing the same thing, uniting, if you will, and seeing what potential impact we could have from week to week, from month to month. Each week we'll give you a new challenge. And there's a Good News Challenge card. We handed them out in the bulletins last week. We didn't do that this week. They're out in the Octagon. They're in a variety of places. And there's 16 different challenges for 16 different weeks. And you know what last week's challenge was? We started off very simply. We wanted to make it real accessible and attainable. All you had to do was recite the Great Commandment every AM and PM for the last week. Now, I haven't seen the map outside, but the whole design of this, it's fun with stickers. For those of you that are a little more enamored with stickers and spirituality, we've got you right where we want you. Because all you do, if you fulfill the challenge of the week, just put the designated sticker on some place that resembles your neighborhood. And now I want to be quick to add, I got several critiques after last week's service, and I'm humbly apologetic. We did not have Gooding, Hagerman, or Murtaugh on the map. Deepest sympathies. But it doesn't mean you don't have to do the challenge just because your city isn't on the map, as I was challenged by last week. What's really cool about it, in some ways it's silly. It's a sticker. Now don't tell that to little kids. They're going to love it. At another level, we're really going to see how this church puts its proverbial faith where its mouth is, or puts our faith into action. From week to week, I think it'll be cool. On the spectrum of challenges, there's something so simple as reciting a couple of scripture verses. There's something as significant as everyone tithing on one particular Sunday. Not to say we won't tithe elsewhere, but wait for that Sunday. That will be intriguing, and we'll bring you more details there. And all points in between. And I want to challenge you for the next 15 weeks now to walk along with us to see what we can do if we concentrate our efforts on one thing together. I think it's going to be an interesting journey. Let us know what happens. Email, call us with any stories that you may have to share. Some of those we can't share. We had a few emails right this week we can't share, but are really cool stories. And what Chuck said last week, you can't work ahead. You can't. He called that cheating. I wouldn't be quite so harsh. But part of the gamesmanship in this is don't work ahead, but you can catch up because we recognize life happens in the midst of a lot of things. So you can catch up, but don't wait till week 16 to do all 16. There's a good chance that won't work. And I've already heard the stories. And this was what was really cool about the story we were doing a year ago, that families did the first challenge together. They read or recited the Great Commandment together. And I think that's another key component of this. Preschool kids are doing stickers. Elementary school kids are doing stickers. Middle and high school students are doing stickers. And we old folks are doing stickers. Again, stickers may not rock your world, but we're doing it with the kids. And I think that will be special. On the last week, we see all the maps side by side. There's 3 other maps in at work, and this is my only caveat today. Make sure your kids leave our map alone, okay? We want just big people stickers, okay? Junior, senior, middle school, senior high has their own map. Little kids have their own map. So just please no abuse of the stickers. Okay, thank you very much. See, here's the thing. There's a lot of good people you and I know. I don't hang out with bad people, quite frankly. I doubt that you do. But it's one thing to be a good person. And there's a lot of that going around. It's another thing to be a follower of Jesus. That extends my goodness to a different level for a different set of reasons. There's no such thing as a random act of kindness in discipleship. There's no random act of kindness because it's always an intentional act of obedience to the call of Jesus. And that's what this Good News Challenge is meant to be. Let me double back, pardon me, on a few things that Chuck highlighted that we want to review, because from time to time we realize that not everybody's here from week to week. And I want to just give you a few Discipleship 101 thoughts for a quick review. And some of this, again, Chuck covered last week. First thing is this: the call to follow the rabbi in Jesus' day was the greatest privilege. It remains, we don't quite understand culturally, contextually, what significance it holds. It remains the great opportunity, the great privilege to be called into a relationship with Jesus, the rabbi, the Son of God himself. Jesus' base of operation, secondly, was in the gospel triangle. It's an important term that we learn to use. It includes the villages of Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida. Is Castleford 150 to 200 in size? Okay, thank you. Capernaum was approximately 1,000 to 1,500 in size. So it gives you a little perspective. The gospel triangle, scholars have debated, but I would align myself with this argument that 75% of Jesus' ministry takes place in the gospel triangle, these three little villages just north of the Sea of Galilee. Let me show you just a couple of pictures before we move on, just to give you an idea. If I'm in the water in the Sea of Galilee looking north, you can't really visualize it perhaps, but if I were to look to the left of that picture, I would see the Mount of Beatitudes. It's really not a mountain, it's a hill that's just a few hundred yards perhaps north of the Sea of Galilee there. And to the right would be, as I journey north, would be the village of Capernaum. Next picture. This is, and it's a touristy kind of place, which is always intriguing. But again, a lot of archaeologists and scholars believe that this is where Simon Peter's mother-in-law lived. And there's a great story of how Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. Well, that's not really funny, but you know, anything with a mother-in-law has some interest. And so, Jesus possibly spent some of his time in the place that you're looking at right now. And honestly, it's pretty cool when you're actually walking through this place and you're seeing it. But you get a sense that this Jesus really did live, 2,000 years ago. And that could have been the place where he spent a lot of his time teaching. And then this last picture is the synagogue in Capernaum, which I believe is the largest synagogue excavated to date in this whole region. It's huge. And adjacent to the synagogue is the synagogue shul, school. So you parents in Capernaum would send your kids to synagogue shul for their education. Chuck highlighted that a little bit last week. So it just gives you a few pictures, and as we move through the series, we'll give you a few more pictures as well. His base of operation, the gospel triangle. Third, the purpose of following the rabbi was to passionately model the rabbi. It wasn't to take copious notes. It wasn't to put your discipleship on your resume as a great academic pedigree. It was to passionately model the rabbi. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." Peter says in 1 Peter 2:21, he said, "To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." The purpose of following the rabbi is to passionately model the rabbi. That's what we're doing here in part with the Gospel Challenge. Then let me summarize quickly Mark 2. There's three little vignettes in Mark chapter 2. The first is the story of some friends allowing four friends lowering another friend who's paralyzed down through the roof of a place where Jesus is teaching. And Jesus here forgives sins. He was accused of blasphemy, and he healed, verses 1 to 12. Then the story that Paige read a few minutes ago, he challenges contemporary relational boundaries. I think it's just crucial for our understanding of who we are as Christians. And then he disciples. The third, verses 18 to 22, again, we won't read that today. He reset the standards of personal piety and places love as the priority. So that's the summary, that's the review. Now to the point. Jesus' ministry, and you can take note here, and it will continue through the rest of the Gospel of Mark, is driven by a combination of priorities and pace. Priorities is, hello, Captain Obvious calling, but don't underestimate the significance of pace. So let's ask ourselves, what are the priorities of Jesus? We just read it, or we recited it together. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the question we've got to ask as we pursue the gospel challenge is, how closely do I align myself with those Christ-like priorities? Specifically, one of the great debates of the rabbinic movement of the first century was this: who's my neighbor? And without getting into the debate, understand there were all sorts of strands and threads to that debate. Who is my neighbor is the priority beneath the story that we just read. And the story is simply this: Jesus calls Levi, other gospel writers call him Matthew, to be a disciple. And what Jesus begins to say by who he calls to follow him is, this is what the neighborhood's going to look like in my kingdom. You know what Levi was? Levi/Matthew. He was a what? An IRS guy. Not really, but I want you to think about that. Any of you ever received a call from the IRS that said something about audit? I'm not looking for a show of hands here, but you know, if you got that call tomorrow morning and someone, hey, this is John Smith from the Internal Revenue Service here in Twin Falls, and we need to have a conversation. Bring your paperwork. I'll let you live with the emotional impact of that moment. Well, I don't want to equate our IRS officials, there may be some of you here today, with them, but tax collectors basically were perceived as, take note, traitors and extortioners. Or you can call it extortioners and traitors. The Jewish people rightly consider them traitors because they worked for the Roman government, the oppressing regime, and had the force of all the Roman garrisons behind them to make them pay taxes. Imagine the government soldiers enforcing tax payment from you. In fact, they were the most visible Jewish collaborators with Rome you could imagine in your community. They were extortioners because they could keep whatever they overcollected. This was a great gig, folks. Jews could bid for the local village or regional tax contract for a city like Capernaum. The Romans awarded the contract to the highest bidder, and then this man would collect taxes, paid the Romans what was theirs, and could keep the remainder for himself. Therefore, there was a lot of incentive for these tax collectors to overcharge and cheat any way they could. The more they could cheat, the more they could extort, the more profit they received. You follow me? An amazing career choice. But this is what happened. When a Jew entered this tax service, he was regarded as a total outcast of society. He was disqualified to be a judge or witness in a court session. He was excommunicated from his local synagogue. And in the eyes of the community, his disgrace extended to the entire extended family. Everyone hated tax collectors. You get it? Yeah. Also, I find this fascinating. Boy, I'd love to be able to document this to 100% probability. But there's a good probability that this particular area, the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, also had a tax booth literally on the beach. There's really no beach, but on the north shore. And every fish that came out of the Sea of Galilee would be taxed accordingly. So see, and let's just picture if this was Levi/Matthew, let's picture him in that little booth as the fishermen of the Sea of Galilee are bringing their nets up on shore. Everybody knows everybody here. It's a town of 1,000 people. And so see the boats coming in with the catch. You see them? Had a good night fishing. Here comes a couple of sets of brothers with their catch. James and John. And they bring their boat up onto the shore. And Matthew meets them and says, hey, looks like a good night. For me, is what he was saying. And then Simon, Peter, and Andrew, another set of brothers, bring their... There's an excellent chance that Levi/Matthew was the tax man who took taxes from those fishermen that brought their boats to the north shore of Galilee. And they all became disciples. So I just picture the day that Jesus introduces Matthew officially to the other disciples. Can you see that one? Oh, you've already met, Jesus says. Again, throw into that mix Simon the Zealot. Zealots hated Rome and anything having to do with Rome, anyone having to do with Rome. Imagine that collection of folks, the 12 disciples. But it begs the question, who's my neighbor? And so out of this story, that's what we see. So who is your neighbor? The story leads us to a perspective. To answer, my neighbor is anyone within my circle of relationships that I would prefer wasn't my neighbor. I don't want to have this guy as one of the 12. I don't want to have to go outside my comfort zone and deal with someone. And what this story begins to submit for our approval is our prejudices. Listen, if we're going to ask the question, who's my neighbor, in the light of Jesus' commands, we've got to stare our prejudices in the face. Whether it's ethnicity or socioeconomic or sexual, whatever the issues may be. Who's our neighbor? There's personal baggage from the past that allows us to sidestep this question. There's negative attitudes towards someone we met. It's those people. And the challenge of Mark chapter 2 is to stretch that dotted line that defines our relational comfort zone. Who's my neighbor? I mean, I love all you guys. I really do. Most of you. I love you. I don't. I do. You're not my issue. But there are a few people. And my guess is I'm not alone. And people I struggle with that I would prefer weren't my neighbor. Now, what Jesus does here in a subtle way is really cool too. There's a word I'd like to introduce to you called havarot. Havarot literally means table fellowship. Now, Jesus has called Levi to be a disciple, and now he goes to hang out at Levi's house with Levi's posse. And this is what Mark 2:15 says. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. We talked about tax collectors. Sinners really encompasses a broad category of folks. It doesn't mean just people who are disobedient to God a lot. This had to do anywhere from moneylenders to prostitutes. It was anyone that was outside the Jewish orthodoxy box in Jesus' day. And so take a look at that verse and look at who was at this party. This party had to be a large party, quite frankly. In fact, we know it was large because the Pharisees are looking at this party from a distance. By definition, they can't attend this party, and they're looking inside, whatever the house looked like, the porch, saying, oh, look who's here. Look who's here. Already early in Jesus' ministry, the Pharisees opposed Jesus for a variety of reasons and asked his disciples, why is he eating with those people? Again, just the brief history. Pharisees from the Hebrew word perushim, which means separated ones. They separated themselves from everything they thought was unholy. They thought everyone except themselves was separated from the love of God. By Jesus' day, however, havarot, this table fellowship, was a well-developed practice. Tax collectors were specifically excluded from Pharisees' table for dinner. Understand this, if havarot still existed, you would only be allowed to dine with certain types of people, and we would dictate what types of people those would be. And we would be very clear, and you would try to skirt the law, and we'd have to develop, like IRS tax code, we'd have to keep developing more and more laws about who you could and who you couldn't eat with or have coffee with. So what Jesus is doing here is he's saying, hey, his table fellowship embraced not only Pharisees, but outcasts, even traitors and extortioners, money launderers and prostitutes, and distinguished him from the Pharisees in a big way. You know, another interesting factoid from the Gospel of Luke, that there are 10 meal stories in Luke's Gospel which point out the significance of meals, of eating together, potlucking, coffee, Kiwi Loco, lattes in the ministry of Jesus. And every time you look at one of the stories in Luke's gospel, those 10 meal stories, his table fellowship includes often the wrong people. There are sinners, there are outsiders, there are women, there is poor, there's enemies. He always is so inclusive in how he eats with folks. And they reveal his attitude about the traditions of his day, both how he observed them and how he dismissed them. Table fellowship, my friends, goes a long way to determining how you answer the question, who's my neighbor? Think about it. Who do you eat meals with beside family? Where do you spend those late night coffee moments, after hours moments? I would say we define table fellowship fairly strongly by that. Who is my neighbor? You know, we talk about this all the time. Who's our neighbor? And I have to tell you, I mentioned this a few months ago, and I'm just not making any progress. I have a next door neighbor. This will be our secret, okay? I have a next door neighbor. And every time I talk about neighbor, I just get filled with guilt because I really don't like this guy. And I won't give you all the details. But I won't give you any details. I'm just not going out of my way to do anything for this guy. Because in my neighborhood, especially next to us, he should be gone in 3 months. That's the apartment, 2 apartments in the house next to us. He should be gone by now. I think it was 6 months ago I introduced you to him. I mean, without him being here. He's still there. He's not moving. I'm friendly to other neighbors who are nice people. But this guy, and I'm not saying he's nasty, I just, I have no interest in getting to know him. So there's my confession. And then a month ago, we were helping out with Burgers and Dogs on Recovery for Life night. And I walk inside the social hall, and there he is. Not only in the social hall, he's right by the entrance I walked in. And I don't know why he was there. But, it just convicted me again how so many people, I could be your neighbor, you could be my neighbor. Sounds like a Mr. Rogers commercial. But there are those people that for whatever reason I've already voted off the island. And in some ways they've never done anything to me, but I just would rather not deal with them. And what Jesus shows in his entire 3-year ministry is how important it is for inclusion to take place when it comes to eating and breaking bread together. And you know this, if you ever have dinner with someone, have lunch with someone, it happens all the time here after church on Sunday. You get to know those people pretty well, don't you? In and out? Anyway, so much for my own therapy. It's the priority of Jesus. And then let's talk about pace. Do I live my life? And this one's a little more intriguing, I think. Do I live my life at a Christ-like pace? Listen to the words of Mark 2. As Jesus walked along, he saw Levi at the tax collector's booth. So many of Jesus' moments, teaching, changing, healing, took place out of this providential impromptu-ness. He lived his life at a pace, as urgent as the purpose of his life was. He lived his life at a pace that allowed him to live out the priority of loving his neighbor. In the midst of his agenda to save the world, he created space for people routinely. Listen, if you're retired here today, we praise God for you. You may not be able to use the excuse of pace anymore. But for the rest of us, we struggle with creating space to love neighbor. Because generally we're hustling so fast in so many different directions to do so many good things that if someone like Matthew Levi came across our path, we'd say, man, woulda, coulda, shoulda. Earlier in chapter 2, he heals a paralytic. He's in the middle of his teaching. These 4 guys lower their friend through a hole in the roof. Now, maybe he had to deal with that. But what's cool about that little passage at the beginning of Mark 2 is it says this, as they're lowering the buddy through the roof, it says he saw their faith. See, Jesus sees things differently, and it leads him to act. He was observant about the people around him. And fulfilling the good news challenge is a challenge not only to our priorities, but the pace at which we live life. Do I live at a pace that allows